Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into the tangled story of one of the franchise's most enigmatic figures. A character who began as a cheerful entertainer, meant to delight children, only to become something twisted and broken. A mess of wires and metal that crawls along ceilings in the dead of night. From a pristine animatronic fox, designed to replace a pirate legend, to a mangled heap of parts that sparked debates lasting nearly a decade, this is the complete story of Mangle. The animatronic that proved sometimes the most fascinating mysteries emerge not from grand conspiracies or hidden murders, but from simple neglect and the careless hands of those too young to understand what they were destroying. Whether you're encountering this character's story for the first time, revisiting familiar details that have haunted the community for years, or simply allowing these words to wash over you as sleep takes hold, we'll explore every aspect of Mangle's existence. The origins in a family pizzeria in 1987, the slow disintegration at the hands of curious toddlers, the ceiling that became a hunting ground, the radio static that spawned countless theories, the jump scare that pointed toward the frontal lobe, the variants that appeared across nightmares and burnt hallucinations, and the lingering question that creator Scott Cawthon answered with a single word that somehow satisfied no one and everyone at once. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of deep exploration into characters who exist in the shadows between innocent entertainment and mechanical horror. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what drew you to Mangle's story in particular. There's something uniquely compelling about an animatronic that was literally torn apart, piece by piece, until even its name became a description of what had been done to it, rather than what it once was. Let's begin. Origins, from Toy Foxy to the Mangle. In the renovated halls of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza during 1987, Fazbear Entertainment invested substantial resources into a new generation of animatronics. The toy line, as they would come to be known, represented a significant departure from the withered performers that had served the original location. These new machines boasted advanced facial recognition technology tied directly into criminal databases, allowing them to scan crowds and theoretically identify threats before danger could materialize. They featured sleek, polished exteriors with glossy finishes that caught the light from the restaurant's fluorescent fixtures. They moved with improved mobility, their servos quieter and their joints more fluid than the jerky, mechanical movements of their predecessors. Among this new lineup stood Toy Freddy with his rosy cheeks and updated top hat, Toy Bonnie, whose bright blue finish gleamed under the party lights, Toy Chica with her removable beak and cupcake companion, and the character who would eventually become known simply as the Mangle. Originally, this fourth member was designed as Toy Foxy, a reimagining of the pirate fox who had frightened children from Pirate Cove in the original location. But where the original Foxy had been designed with a menacing hook, tattered appearance, and aggressive pirate theme, this new version was meant to be approachable, friendly, and above all, safe for the youngest visitors. The design philosophy behind what would become the Mangle represented Fazbear Entertainment's attempt to learn from past mistakes. The original Foxy had proven too intimidating for some children, his sharp hook and exposed endoskeleton parts causing tears and nightmares that translated into parent complaints and potential liability issues. So when the redesign came, it swung hard in the opposite direction. Gone was the hook, replaced with a normal hand. Gone was the eye patch and weathered pirate aesthetic. Gone was the intimidating red and brown color scheme. In their place emerged something gentler. Toy Foxy stood with white plastic casing accented in pink, a color scheme that immediately softened the character's appearance and made it seem less threatening to young eyes. Pink eyelids with long eyelashes gave the face an almost doll-like quality, while rosy red cheeks added to the friendly, approachable design. A pink bow tie decorated the chest, matching the pink accents on the feet and hands. Lipstick was applied to the elongated snout, haphazardly dotted on in a way that suggested either intentional playfulness or perhaps hasty application by maintenance staff who weren't quite artists. The overall effect was meant to be whimsical, cartoonish, and most importantly, non-threatening. But the design team made one critical decision that would prove to be Toy Foxy's undoing. They designated this animatronic for Kids Cove, a special area of the restaurant dedicated to the youngest patrons. It was a supervised play space where toddlers and young children could interact with entertainment, while parents enjoyed their meals or older siblings played arcade games in other sections. The theory was sound. Place the friendliest-looking animatronic in the area, specifically designed for the most vulnerable guests. Let the little ones become comfortable with the characters through close interaction. Build positive associations early. What they failed to account for was the nature of toddlers themselves. Young children, particularly those in the 2 to 4 year age range, learn about the world through tactile exploration. They touch, they pull, they dismantle. It's not malicious, it's developmental. They lack the fine motor control and understanding of consequences that would make them gentle with fragile objects. And Toy Foxy, for all its advanced technology and expensive components, was not built to withstand the enthusiastic exploration of dozens of small hands day after day. The staff first noticed the problem within days of opening Kids Cove. Children would grab at the animatronic's extremities during its performances. They would tug on the costume's fabric covering. They would pull at exposed wiring if they found even the smallest gap in the casing. The animatronic's bright colors and friendly demeanor, rather than encouraging gentle interaction, seemed to invite aggressive play. To the toddlers, Toy Foxy wasn't a performer to be watched. It was a toy to be played with, taken apart, and investigated. At first, maintenance staff dutifully reassembled the animatronic after each shift. They would arrive in Kids Cove to find pieces scattered across the floor. An arm here, disconnected at the shoulder joint. Chunks of white plastic casing there torn free from the endoskeleton beneath. Wiring pulled loose and dangling like synthetic intestines. The head, sometimes completely detached, would be found in a corner, its eyes still functioning and tracking movement, even while separated from the body. Each evening, technicians would spend hours carefully reattaching components, rewiring systems, and testing that everything functioned properly before the next day's opening. But this pattern couldn't sustain itself. The constant disassembly and reassembly took a toll not just on staff hours, but on the animatronic itself. Joints that were repeatedly pulled apart began to loosen. Connections that were constantly severed and rejoined became less reliable. The casing, repeatedly torn away, developed cracks and stress fractures that made it even easier for small hands to find purchase and pull. What had been a pristine state-of-the-art animatronic began to show serious wear within weeks. Management faced a decision. They could remove Toy Foxy from Kids Cove entirely, disappointing the young visitors who seemed to genuinely enjoy their rough play with the character. They could invest in constant repairs, accepting the labor hours and replacement parts as an ongoing cost of operation. Or they could find a third option, a way to turn the liability into an attraction. Being Fazbear Entertainment, they chose the path that required the least effort and could be spun as intentional. Phone Guy, in his recorded messages to night guards, explained the eventual decision with his characteristic mix of corporate spin and honest weariness. The staff had tried putting Toy Foxy back together after every shift, he noted, but eventually they gave up. Instead of fighting the inevitable, they left the animatronic in its dismantled state and rebranded the situation as a feature rather than a bug. Kids Cove became home to a take apart and put back together attraction, where children could interact with animatronic parts in a supposedly safe, supervised environment. This was when Toy Foxy ceased to exist and the Mangle was born. The name wasn't official designation or marketing branding. It was what the employees called the heap of parts that accumulated in Kids Cove, a casual shorthand that captured the reality of the situation. This animatronic had been mangled beyond any hope of returning to its original state. The name stuck, first among staff who had to deal with the constantly shifting pile of technology and torn costume pieces, and eventually among the children themselves, who knew the attraction not as a friendly fox, but as the Mangle. What made this transformation particularly tragic was that it represented a complete inversion of the original intent. Toy Foxy had been designed as the safest, friendliest version of Foxy possible. It was meant to prove that the character could be reimagined without the threatening elements. But in trying to make something perfectly safe and approachable for the youngest children, the designers had created something that those same children would destroy. The very friendliness that was supposed to protect kids from fear had instead created a situation where the kids themselves became the destroyers, turning a sleek, modern performer into a twisted mess of parts that looked like it had survived some kind of industrial accident. And so the Mangle existed in this liminal state for the weeks and months that the 1987 location remained operational. During the day, children would pull it apart with gleeful abandon, scattering pieces across Kids Cove while parents watched from nearby tables, perhaps uncomfortable but uncertain whether to intervene in what appeared to be a sanctioned activity. Employees would occasionally attempt to consolidate the parts into something resembling a coherent shape, but they stopped trying to actually fix anything. The Mangle became a permanent fixture in a permanent state of disrepair. But what happened during the night, when the children went home and the lights dimmed, would prove far more sinister than anyone expected. The animatronic that had been torn apart by innocent hands would learn to move in its broken state, crawling through the building in ways no intact machine ever could. Physical appearance and design. To understand what the Mangle became, we must first appreciate the complexity of what it looked like in its destroyed state. This wasn't simply a damaged animatronic. It was a nightmarish assembly of parts that had been torn, twisted, and rearranged so many times that describing it required paragraphs where other characters needed only sentences. The most immediately noticeable feature was the head, or rather, the heads. The main head retained the general fox shape of the original Toy Foxy design, but all pretense of the friendly, put-together performer had long since vanished. White plastic casing, now scuffed and cracked from constant handling, formed the base structure. The elongated snout still bore traces of pink lipstick, though it was smeared and partially worn away, giving it an almost clownish appearance in certain lights. One eye socket contained what appeared to be a functioning eye, a glossy amber orb with a black pupil that could still track movement, suggesting that at least some of the Mangle systems remained operational, despite the physical trauma. The other socket was dark, either missing its eye entirely or containing one that no longer functioned. The pink eyelids, initially designed to give Toy Foxy a friendly, approachable look, now hung at odd angles, creating an expression that could generously be called confused and less generously be called disturbed. The rosy red cheeks that had once added to the character's charm now stood out starkly against the dirty white casing, like makeup on a corpse. Pink bow tie still clung to the chassis, attached by mechanisms that had somehow survived the repeated destruction, while more essential components had been torn away. But the main head was only the beginning, attached to what might once have been a neck, or perhaps to a shoulder, or possibly to some entirely different part of the endoskeleton, depending on how the day's disassembly had gone, was a second head. This one appeared to be purely endoskeleton, lacking any cosmetic casing whatsoever. It was a bare skull of metal and mechanical components, dominated by a single staring eye that bore the Mangle's distinctive amber iris. This secondary head raised immediate questions that the games never explicitly answered. Was it part of the original Toy Foxy design, perhaps a backup system, or internal mechanism that was never meant to be visible? Had it been taken from another animatronic entirely and somehow attached to the Mangle's frame? Or had the constant deconstruction and reconstruction created something new? A fusion of parts that resulted in a chimeric creation with components from multiple sources. Supporting these two heads was what could loosely be called a body, though collection of endoskeleton parts vaguely arranged in body-like configuration might be more accurate. The torso appeared to have almost no remaining casing, exposing the complex mechanical systems underneath. Unlike other animatronics where the endoskeleton was hidden beneath costume and casing, the Mangle's inner workings were on full display. Servos and joints moved in plain sight. Wiring hung loose, draping from connection points like grotesque decorations. The entire assembly looked less like a performer and more like a dissection, as if someone had decided to create a working animatronic while removing anything that might hide how it functioned. The limbs presented their own puzzle. At any given time, the Mangle appeared to have more limbs than a fox should possess. Most sources agreed on 3 legs being visible in various camera angles, with one seeming to emerge from behind another in a configuration that defied standard anatomy. Some theorists proposed that this meant the Mangle was composed of multiple endoskeletons, perhaps Toy Foxy combined with parts from other scrapped units, creating a creature with 8 limbs total when you counted both heads as part of the equation. Others suggested the extra parts were simply attached in non-standard locations during the daily disassembly, giving the illusion of multiple bodies merged into one. Arms extended from the torso at angles that seemed to shift between sightings. One arm might be raised, hanging from the ceiling support structure. Another might dangle downward, fingers twitching with servo movements. The hands themselves lacked the hook that characterized the original Foxy, but didn't exactly look safe. They were mechanical claws capable of gripping and climbing, though whether this was original design or emergent capability from the mangled state remained unclear. The entire assembly was festooned with wiring. Red, blue, yellow, and white cables snaked between components, some still connected to actual systems, others torn loose and dangling freely. These wires became one of the Mangle's most distinctive visual elements. They hung like organic matter, like veins or intestines, creating the impression that this wasn't just a broken machine, but something that had been violently opened up, its insides exposed for all to see. The wires would sway when the Mangle moved, adding to the disturbing quality of its locomotion. Pink accents appeared throughout the assembly, callbacks to the original toy Foxy design. Pink nail polish on the feet, clearly visible in detail renders. Pink segments on what remained of the costume pieces. Pink eyelids on the main head. These touches of color served as reminders of what this character was supposed to be, making the contrast with what it had become all the more striking. It was like seeing a party hat on a scarecrow. The cheerful detail only emphasized the wrongness of everything else. The overall color scheme remained white and pink, but these bright, clean colors were undercut by the darkness of exposed endoskeleton, the tangle of multicolored wiring, and the shadows created by the jumbled arrangement of parts. Where Toy Foxy would have been primarily white with pink accents, the Mangle was primarily shadow and metal with white and pink interrupting the industrial greys and blacks. What made the Mangle's appearance particularly unsettling was how it seemed to change depending on perspective and lighting. In some camera angles, it looked almost recognizable as a fox-shaped animatronic that had simply been damaged. In others, it appeared to be an incomprehensible mass of parts that happened to have a fox head attached somewhere in the assembly. The lack of a consistent solid form meant that the mind couldn't quite settle on what it was looking at. This ambiguity in the visual design created unease on a fundamental level. Humans are generally comfortable with things they can categorize and understand, but the Mangle resisted easy categorization. Looking closely at various renders and in-game appearances revealed additional details that added to the unsettling quality. The endoskeleton teeth visible in both heads were sharp, designed for the kind of precise mechanical movements that allowed animatronics to speak and sing, but looking disturbingly capable of causing harm in a way that purely cosmetic teeth would not. The joints at shoulders and hips appeared to have more range of motion than standard animatronic construction would typically allow, possibly a result of components being attached incorrectly during reassembly, or possibly an intentional design feature that allowed for the enhanced mobility the character would demonstrate. Even at rest, the Mangle looked wrong. Other animatronics, even in their broken states, maintained some semblance of how they were meant to look. Withered Bonnie was clearly Bonnie despite missing his face. Withered Chica was recognizably Chica despite the damage. But the Mangle at rest was just a heap, a pile of parts arranged with no clear logic, looking less like a deactivated performer and more like the aftermath of an explosion in a robotics factory. This physical appearance wasn't just aesthetic. It was thematic. The Mangle looked like what it was, something that had been broken by careless handling and then left broken because fixing it was too much trouble. It was neglect made visible, decay given form, the natural endpoint of treating complex machinery as disposable entertainment. And somehow, despite, or perhaps because of this appearance, it could still move, still hunt, still function in the darkness when it should have been nothing more than scrap metal waiting to be cleared away. Behavior and mechanics in FNAF 2. The transformation from daytime attraction to nighttime threat marked the Mangle as one of the most unique animatronics in the 1987 locations roster. Unlike the toy animatronics who moved with obvious mechanical purpose, or the withered units whose aggressive behavior seemed fueled by malfunction and possible possession, The Mangle exhibited a pattern of movement that seemed almost organic, like a living creature that had simply learned to exist in its broken state. According to the mechanics observable across the 5 nights of gameplay, the Mangle began each night in Kids Cove, that same play area where children had torn it apart during daylight hours. Security cameras captured it in the corner of the room, a contorted heap of machinery that might appear to be simply piled parts, if not for the occasional twitch of a servo or glint from those amber eyes. This starting position was significant. The Mangle didn't begin on a stage like Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Toy Chica. It didn't have a designated home position that represented its purpose as a performer. It started in the place where it had been destroyed, suggesting that even in whatever passed for its consciousness, the Mangle identified not with what it was meant to be, but with what it had become. The timing of the Mangle's activation varied based on the night and AI difficulty settings, but it was notably aggressive compared to many other animatronics. As early as 12 a.m. on night 2, it could leave Kids Cove and begin its journey through the restaurant, appearing in the hallway outside the office, potentially within the first hour of the shift. This wasn't a slow, methodical stalker that took hours to reach the player's position. This was an active threat from the moment the night began, treating the 8-hour shift not as something to slowly fill with menace, but as a limited window of hunting time. What truly set the Mangle apart was its method of locomotion. While other animatronics walked through hallways or occasionally crawled through vents, the Mangle traveled primarily along the ceiling. Security camera footage revealed it hanging from ceiling infrastructure, its multiple limbs wrapped around support beams and light fixtures as it pulled itself along overhead. The tangle of limbs that looked so chaotic in Kids Cove proved surprisingly effective for this mode of travel. The extra arms and legs could grip multiple points simultaneously, distributing weight and allowing for movement that would be impossible for a standard bipedal animatronic. The route it took provided insight into its behavior patterns. From Kids Cove, it would move through the prize corner, an area filled with gifts and decorations that it navigated with surprising grace despite its unwieldy appearance. From there into the game area, where arcade machines cast flickering light across its white and pink casing, creating shadows that made it difficult to track its exact position. Through the main hall, with its checkered floor and party tables, the Mangle would continue along the ceiling, unencumbered by the obstacles that might slow or redirect floor-based animatronics. The hallway outside the office represented a critical decision point in the Mangle's behavior. Unlike animatronics who would enter the office directly from the hallway, the Mangle would instead divert through Party Room 1 and then Party Room 2, taking what seemed like a deliberately indirect route. This wasn't random pathfinding. It was a consistent pattern that suggested either programming or learned behavior designed to approach from an unexpected angle. After traversing both party rooms, it would finally enter the right air vent, the same passage used by Toy Bonnie and several other threats. Here's where the Mangle's behavior became particularly noteworthy from a gameplay perspective. The right air vent had a blind spot, an area that the cameras couldn't see, but where animatronics could lurk just before entering the office. Most animatronics approaching through this vent would simply proceed into the office at their next opportunity, but the Mangle provided an audio cue that made it unique among the vent-based threats. When the Mangle was in the vent, whether visible on cameras or in the blind spot, it produced a distinctive radiostatic sound, a harsh electronic noise that was unmistakable once you learned to recognize it. This wasn't music box winding or footsteps or any of the other audio cues the game used to signal danger. It was pure static interference, like tuning past stations on an old radio, loud enough to hear even without headphones, but absolutely impossible to miss with proper audio equipment. This made the Mangle somewhat easier to track than animatronics who moved in complete silence. You didn't necessarily need to check the right vent camera if you could hear that telltale static. The moment that sound started, you knew what was coming. The appropriate response when detecting the Mangle in or approaching the right vent was to don the Freddy Fazbear head, that hollow mask that served as the primary defense mechanism in the 1987 location. The Mangle, like most animatronics, would be fooled by this disguise, seeing another animatronic rather than a potential threat or target. It would eventually leave the vent and return to its patrol route, giving the player a temporary reprieve. However, and this is where the Mangle's mechanics became particularly dangerous, if the player made a crucial mistake in timing, the encounter would end very differently. If you brought up the monitor to check cameras, saw or heard the Mangle, but then lowered the monitor before putting on the mask, you triggered a special behavior that bypassed all normal defenses. In this scenario, the Mangle would complete its entry into the office, but instead of approaching from the floor or vent, it would appear on the ceiling, hanging directly above you with its head dangling down at face level. This ceiling position was a critical detail for multiple reasons. First, it meant the Mangle was one of the few animatronics that utilized vertical space in its attacks, approaching from above rather than from the expected horizontal plane. Second, and more importantly for the lore implications we'll discuss later, it meant that the Mangle's jump scare came from above, its jaws swinging down toward the player's face rather than lunging forward like most other animatronics. Once the Mangle had achieved this ceiling position in the office, the Freddy head no longer worked. You could put it on, take it off, put it on again. It didn't matter. The Mangle wasn't fooled and wasn't leaving. At this point, the encounter had essentially entered a countdown timer. Eventually, whether after you raised and lowered the monitor or simply waited long enough, the Mangle would attack. The jump scare itself was distinctive and terrifying. The Mangle's multiple heads would swing into view, jaws wide, with that second endoskeleton head, adding an extra layer of nightmare fuel to the image. The audio that accompanied the attack was the same electronic screech used for most animatronic jump scares. But the visual, the sight of this tangled mass of parts and wiring lunging from above with multiple heads and too many eyes, that was pure Mangle. Another notable aspect of the Mangle's behavior was how it interacted with other animatronics. According to observations documented by players who studied the mechanics extensively, the Mangle had a tendency to enter the office when another animatronic was already present. This created situations where you might be dealing with, say, Toy Bonnie's approach, while simultaneously hearing the Mangle's static in the vents. The game seemed to deliberately create these compound threats, forcing players to manage multiple dangers simultaneously. But the Mangle's tendency to arrive during other encounters made it feel almost opportunistic, like it was taking advantage of the player's divided attention. The static interference the Mangle created when moving between cameras was another mechanic worth noting. When it transitioned from one camera view to another, the camera feed would briefly cut to static, similar to how other animatronics caused visual distortions when moving. But the Mangle's static felt more pronounced, more sustained, as if its very presence interfered with electronic systems in a way that other animatronics didn't. This could be explained mechanically as the extensive damage to its systems creating electromagnetic interference, or it could hint at something more supernatural, depending on how one interpreted the evidence. The Mangle was also notably active. It didn't have the slow, methodical pacing of some animatronics who took hours to complete their patrol routes. It could leave Kids Cove early and arrive at the office within the first hour or two of a shift, meaning that players couldn't rely on the early night being a safe period to conserve power and plan strategies. From the moment 12 a.m. rolled around on night 2 and beyond, the Mangle was a potential threat that demanded attention. What made this behavior particularly interesting from a lore perspective was that there was no clear explanation for why the Mangle could move at all in its destroyed state. Other animatronics, even damaged ones, retained basic structural integrity. The withered animatronics had missing parts and exposed endoskeletons, but they still had coherent bodies with standard limb placement. The Mangle, by contrast, was parts that shouldn't be able to coordinate movement, let alone navigate complex environments using ceiling-based locomotion. Either its internal systems were far more sophisticated than they appeared, allowing it to adapt to its damaged configuration, or something else was animating it, giving purpose and direction to what should have been non-functional scrap. The ceiling crawling in particular suggested capabilities beyond original programming. Standard animatronic programming would be designed for walking, standing, perhaps limited arm movements for performance purposes. But complex climbing, gripping ceiling fixtures, distributing weight across multiple limbs while moving in 3 dimensions. These were behaviors that seemed to emerge from the damaged state rather than existing within it. The Mangle had somehow learned or been taught to move in ways that its designers never intended, adapting to its broken body with a facility that suggested intelligence rather than mere programmed responses. This adaptive behavior, combined with the aggressive hunting pattern, the strategic use of alternate routes through party rooms, and the coordinated attacks that occurred when the player was already managing other threats, all of it painted a picture of an animatronic that was more than just mechanically dangerous. It was cunning, it was persistent, and it was perfectly suited to its environment in a way that pristine toy Foxy never could have been, because it had been forced to adapt or become truly non-functional, and it had chosen adaptation, the mysterious radiostatic. Among the many peculiarities that defined the Mangle, few generated as much speculation and debate as the radiostatic that accompanied its movements. This wasn't simple white noise or generic electronic interference. It was a complex audio phenomenon that sounded distinctly like radio transmission, complete with what seemed to be voices, code sequences, and structured communication buried beneath layers of distortion and static. The fact that this sound was specific to the Mangle rather than being used for all animatronics suggested intentional design, leading the community down countless paths of investigation, trying to decode what, if anything, these sounds might mean. The basic facts were straightforward enough. When the Mangle was in the right air vent, approaching the office, or sometimes simply moving between camera views, players would hear this distinctive static. It was loud, harsh, and unmistakable. The kind of sound that would immediately grab a player's attention, even if they weren't actively listening for audio cues. The quality resembled amateur radio transmissions, specifically what radio enthusiasts would identify as RTTY75W, or radio teletype at 75 baud wide. This was a mode of communication used primarily in military and emergency broadcasting, characterized by its distinctive warbling tone beneath the static. Within this static, careful listeners reported hearing what sounded like voices, not clear speech, but fragmented words and phrases that seemed to emerge from the noise before being swallowed back into it. Some players claimed to hear 10-1 in the transmissions, a police radio code that means poor reception or receiving poorly. This led to elaborate theories about the Mangle attempting to contact authorities, potentially tied to the facial recognition and criminal detection features that Phone Guy mentioned, were built into the toy animatronics. The 10-1 theory proposed that the Mangle, seeing the night guard as a potential threat, based on its malfunctioning facial recognition software, was attempting to alert police to the presence of a criminal in the building. The poor reception code would make sense if the Mangle's heavily damaged state had compromised its communication systems, leaving it broadcasting an emergency signal that couldn't quite connect to its intended recipients. Some theorists even suggested darker implications. What if a police officer had responded to one of these signals and been attacked by the animatronics, leading to their own emergency broadcast of 10-1 before being killed? This would explain why the sound continued to loop through the Mangle's systems, a recorded snippet of the last transmission it received before something terrible happened. Others heard different content in the static. Some claimed to make out phrases like, "No more back, try little help," when the audio was isolated and cleaned up in programs like Audacity. This interpretation painted the Mangle as crying out for assistance, begging to be repaired or released from its broken existence. The fragmented nature of the speech could represent how its damaged voice box could only produce corrupted attempts at communication, or it could suggest multiple overlapping voices if, as some theories proposed, the Mangle was possessed by multiple spirits. The spectrogram theory added another dimension to the mystery. Spectrograms are tools that convert audio into visual representations, allowing hidden images to be discovered in sound files. This technique had been used famously in games like Portal 2, where developers hid images in what sounded like random noise. Naturally, FNAF theorists attempted the same process with the Mangle static. Some claim to see the words "It's me" in the resulting spectrogram, those same words that appeared throughout FNAF 1 as ghostly hallucinations and mysterious messages. If true, this would link the Mangle directly to the broader spirit possession narrative that underlay the franchise, suggesting that whatever entity or entities inhabited the mangled animatronic were trying to communicate their identity or warn about someone's presence. However, the truth about the Mangle static proved more mundane than many of these elaborate theories. Through careful investigation, including tracking down the actual source files, researchers discovered that the sound was a stock audio effect, specifically a drone telemetry recording that creator Scott Cawthon had purchased and incorporated into the game. The sound could be found on stock audio websites, clearly labeled as radio telemetry, with no hidden messages, encoded transmissions, or secret communications buried within it. This revelation didn't sit well with everyone in the community. After hours spent trying to decode the static, after theories about police responses and possessed spirits and emergency broadcasts, learning that it was just a purchased sound effect felt almost anticlimactic. Some theorists pushed back, arguing that even if Scott had used a stock sound, he might have deliberately chosen one that contained certain elements he wanted included. The presence of what sounded like voices in the telemetry wasn't accidental, they argued. Even if those voices came from the original recording, rather than being added specifically for FNAF. The pragmatic explanation, which eventually gained general acceptance, was that the Mangle's static served an aesthetic and mechanical purpose, rather than a lore one. Aesthetically, it enhanced the horror of the Mangle's presence. The harsh industrial quality of radio interference fit perfectly with an animatronic that was torn apart and exposed, its internal systems visible and malfunctioning. The sound suggested damage, breakdown, systems operating outside their normal parameters, all of which aligned with the Mangle's visual design and narrative role. Mechanically, the static served as an audio cue to help players track the Mangle's position. Unlike animatronics that moved silently, the Mangle announced its presence, giving players information they could use to defend themselves. This wasn't a mercy to the player so much as a balancing decision. The Mangle was aggressive, fast, and dangerous enough that it needed a clear telegraph to prevent it from feeling unfair. The static provided that telegraph, allowing skilled players to respond appropriately without needing to constantly check the right vent camera. The fact that the Mangle, of all animatronics, would have this radio interference issue also made logical sense from an in-universe perspective. Its voice box was presumably damaged from all the disassembly and reassembly. Its internal systems were exposed and likely experiencing interference from environmental factors. If any animatronic was going to produce strange electronic sounds, it would be the one that looked like it had been through a shredder. The static wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was simply another expression of the Mangle's broken state, an audible representation of damage that was clearly visible in its appearance. Yet for all this pragmatic explanation, there remained something eerie about the static that went beyond mere mechanics. The human brain is wired to find patterns in noise, to hear voices in static, to see faces in random shadows. This psychological phenomenon, called pareidolia, meant that anyone listening closely to the Mangle's transmissions could convince themselves they heard words, codes, messages, and even knowing intellectually that it was stock audio didn't quite shake the instinctive sense that something was trying to communicate through the noise. Perhaps that's what made the Mangle's static so effective as a horror element. It wasn't just that it signaled danger or added to the atmosphere. It was that it created a space for interpretation, for imagination, for the mind to fill in meaning where perhaps none existed. Every player who spent time analyzing the sounds came away with slightly different interpretations, slightly different things they claimed to hear. And in a franchise built on mysteries and hidden meanings, a sound that seemed like it should contain a message but ultimately might not became its own kind of enigma. The voices that players heard in the static, whether they were saying 10-1, or it's me, or help, or nothing intelligible at all, represented what the Mangle itself had become, something broken that people desperately wanted to understand, to decode, to make whole again through interpretation. The static was semantic white noise that invited projection, allowing each theorist to hear what fit their personal understanding of what the Mangle was and what it meant. In the end, the Mangle's radio static remained what it had always been, a sound that signaled the approach of a threat, that added to the industrial horror of the character's presentation, and that created a phenomenon where the community heard meaning in noise, because the alternative, that it was just a sound effect with no deeper significance, felt somehow unsatisfying. Sometimes the mystery isn't in what's being said, but in why we're so convinced something must be being said at all. The great gender debate. No aspect of the Mangle's identity generated more persistent, passionate, and ultimately unresolvable discussion than the question of the character's gender. For nearly a decade, the FNAF community debated, argued, and theorized about whether the Mangle was male, female, both, neither, or something else entirely. The fact that creator Scott Cawthon eventually weighed in with an answer that somehow resolved nothing while acknowledging everything speaks to how the question had become less about solving a mystery and more about what the mystery represented. The debate had clear origins in the contradictory evidence presented across the games. On one side stood those who argued the Mangle was male, basing their position on what seemed like authoritative in-game sources. Phone Guy, in his Night 3 recorded message in FNAF 2, referred to the Mangle using masculine pronouns. "I think the employees refer to him as just the Mangle," he said, establishing that at least some characters in the game's world understood the animatronic as male. Since Phone Guy was generally considered a reliable narrator, at least regarding factual information about the restaurant and its operations, his pronoun usage carried significant weight. Additionally, the Mangle was, by design, a reimagined version of Foxy, and Foxy had been consistently portrayed as male throughout the franchise. The original Foxy, with his deep voice and pirate swagger, was clearly masculine in presentation. It seemed logical that a replacement version of that character would maintain the same gender, even if the aesthetic had been softened and made more child-friendly. The precedent of other toy animatronics suggested this pattern. Toy Freddy was male like Freddy. Toy Bonnie was male like Bonnie. Why would Toy Foxy be any different? The counter-arguments, however, were equally compelling. The Mangle's appearance featured distinctly feminine characteristics that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. The pink color scheme, while not exclusively feminine, was culturally coded as such and stood in stark contrast to the reds and browns of the original Foxy. The lipstick, haphazardly applied but clearly intentional, suggested femininity in its presentation. The eyelashes, long and pronounced, were a visual shorthand for female characters in animation and game design. Even the pink nail polish visible on the feet pointed toward a traditionally feminine aesthetic. Most significantly, the Mangle appeared in Custom Night's Ladies' Night preset, which featured only female animatronics. This preset included Toy Chica and both withered and toy versions of Chica, characters who were clearly and consistently female. The inclusion of the Mangle in this specifically gendered challenge seemed to indicate that the developers considered it female, or at least female enough, to belong in a challenge defined by that characteristic. While some argued that Foxy also appeared in the Double Trouble preset despite being male, making preset inclusion unreliable as evidence, the specific naming of Ladies' Night seemed harder to dismiss as mere gameplay balancing. As the franchise expanded, additional evidence emerged that complicated rather than clarified the picture. In FNAF World, loading screens referred to the Mangle with both masculine and feminine pronouns in different instances. One screen would use she, another would use he, and this seemed far too consistent to be accidental typos. Scott Cawthon, who had proven himself meticulous about details in his games, would have noticed and corrected these inconsistencies if they were mistakes. The fact that both remained suggested intention, but intention toward what end remained unclear. The Ultimate Custom Night descriptions and voice lines added more fuel to the fire. The game used both he and she pronouns for the Mangle in different contexts, sometimes within the same general time frame, making it clear that the mixed pronoun usage wasn't an evolution of the character's presentation, but rather a deliberate choice to maintain ambiguity. Toy Chica, had a voice line that referenced getting a beak lodged in your forehead, which some interpreted as evidence she caused the bite of 87, but others used to argue about the Mangle's role in that incident, further tangling gender evidence with other law debates. As the arguments intensified and the evidence remained contradictory, the community began demanding direct clarification from Scott Cawthon himself. What seemed like a simple question, is the Mangle a boy or a girl, deserved a simple answer. Surely the creator knew what gender he had intended for the character. All he needed to do was confirm it, and years of debate could be settled. Scott's response, delivered via a Steam community post, became instantly legendary in the FNAF community. When asked directly whether the Mangle was a boy or a girl, he replied with a single word, yes. This answer was immediately and variously interpreted as trolling, genius, commentary, and frustration. Yes wasn't a gender. It didn't confirm male or female. It seemed to confirm both or neither, or the question itself. The response spawned countless memes, with yes becoming the unofficial canonical answer to Mangle's gender in community discussions. What gender is the Mangle? Yes. It was funny, frustrating, and strangely perfect. Some interpreted Scott's yes as confirmation that the Mangle was gender fluid or non-binary, existing outside traditional gender categories. This reading suggested that the mixed pronouns weren't inconsistencies, but accurate representations of a character whose gender identity didn't fit neatly into male or female boxes. For some fans, particularly those who identified as non-binary or gender fluid themselves, this interpretation was meaningful representation in an unexpected place. The Mangle became, in this reading, one of the first major non-binary characters in the mainstream gaming, even if that status was more implied than explicitly stated. Others saw Scott's answer as simply an acknowledgement that he had deliberately left the question ambiguous and had no intention of resolving it. In this interpretation, the Mangle's gender was meant to be a mystery without an answer, a detail that players could decide for themselves based on their interpretation of the evidence. Scott saying yes was his way of confirming that both interpretations were valid, that the character could be read as male or female depending on which evidence you prioritized, and that there was no secret truth waiting to be discovered because the ambiguity itself was the point. A more cynical interpretation suggested that Scott had simply made a mistake early in the game's development, creating a character with feminine visual design but masculine pronoun references, and rather than retconning one or the other, he had decided to lean into the confusion and turn it into an intentional mystery. The yes answer would then be his way of avoiding admitting the original inconsistency, while making it seem like a deliberate choice all along. Some fans, particularly those frustrated by Scott's non-answer, argued that the debate was pointless from the start. The Mangle was a robot, an animatronic character designed to entertain children. Animatronics didn't have biological sex, and while they might be programmed with certain gendered behaviors or aesthetic presentations, those were design choices rather than intrinsic characteristics. Asking about the Mangle's real gender was like asking about the gender of a car or a computer. It was applying biological categories to non-biological entities. But this argument missed why the debate mattered to people. In storytelling, even non-human characters have gender presentations that affect how audiences relate to them. We refer to ships and nations with gendered pronouns. We assign gender to toys, to pets, to objects of affection and identification. The question of the Mangle's gender wasn't really about biological sex, but about how we understood the character, how we related to it, what role it played in our interpretation of the story. Was it a masculine character feminized through damage and reconstruction? A feminine character given masculine pronouns by people who saw only what it replaced rather than what it was? Something that transcended the binary entirely. The fact that Scott never provided a definitive answer beyond yes meant that all of these interpretations remained valid. The Mangle became whatever each player needed it to be for their understanding of the story. Those who wanted a tragic figure of a female character destroyed and renamed by callous employees could read it that way. Those who saw masculine coding in the original Foxy connection could maintain that interpretation. Those who needed representation of gender ambiguity or fluidity could find it in the deliberately mixed signals. In a franchise built on mysteries and hidden meanings, the Mangle's gender became perhaps the perfect mystery, one that had no answer because the question itself was the point. It forced players to examine what they considered evidence, how they prioritized different sources of information, what biases they brought to interpretation. Pink equals female, but why? Phone Guy said he, but was he reliable? The creators intended, but did intention matter if the text supported multiple readings? By leaving the question unresolved, Scott created space for every interpretation to coexist. The Mangle was male. The Mangle was female. The Mangle was both. The Mangle was neither. The Mangle was yes, a character whose identity existed in the ambiguity, whose truth was that there was no single truth. And perhaps that was the most appropriate answer for an animatronic that existed as scattered parts, never fully one thing, always multiple pieces trying to function as a whole. The Bite of 87, theory. Among the many mysteries that defined Five Nights at Freddy's, few generated as much speculation as the Bite of 87. Phone Guy mentioned it in passing during the first game's opening night, describing an incident where someone lost their frontal lobe to an animatronic attack. The human body's amazing ability to function without this brain region, he noted with dark humor, though the victim's survival came at tremendous cost. This single reference spawned years of theories about which animatronic was responsible, what exactly happened, and whether we witnessed the incident itself in any of the games. For a significant portion of the community, the Mangle became the prime suspect. The evidence supporting this theory was substantial enough that it became one of the most widely accepted explanations, even if it was never definitively confirmed. Understanding why so many theorists pointed to the Mangle requires examining not just the specific clues, but how they connected to the broader timeline and mechanics of the series. The first piece of evidence was timing. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was set in 1987, as confirmed by the paycheck received after completing Night 5, which showed a date of November the 12th, 1987. The game took place during the week leading up to the Bite, which Phone Guy mentioned in the first game as having already occurred in the past. This meant the incident had to happen either during or shortly after Jeremy Fitzgerald's work week at the location, establishing a direct temporal connection between the events of FNAF 2 and the infamous attack. Phone Guy's final call to Jeremy delivered crucial information. He mentioned that someone had used a spare yellow suit from the back room, causing the animatronics to act aggressively and leading to an investigation that put the restaurant under lockdown. But despite these obvious problems, Jeremy was being transferred to the day shift for a birthday party event before the location would permanently close. This day shift assignment on what the community calculated would be November 13th or 14th, potentially Friday the 13th based on calendar calculations, placed Jeremy in the building during operating hours, with animatronics active and children present. Exactly the scenario where the bite could occur. The Mangle's jump scare provided perhaps the most compelling visual evidence. Unlike other animatronics who lunged forward at the player or grabbed from the sides, the Mangle attacked from above, swinging down from the ceiling with its jaws open wide. The angle of attack targeted the top of the player's head, specifically the area where the forehead met the hairline. This was significant because the frontal lobe, the brain region that Phone Guy mentioned was removed during the bite of 87, is located directly behind the forehead. An attack from above, teeth closing on the upper face, would be perfectly positioned to bite into that specific area of the brain. Further supporting this trajectory, examination of the Mangle's teeth and jaw structure revealed sharp endoskeleton teeth that were functional rather than merely cosmetic. While other animatronics had teeth that were part of their costume design, the Mangle's exposed endoskeleton meant its teeth were mechanical components designed to interlock and exert significant force. These weren't prop teeth that would collapse harmlessly. They were industrial machinery capable of crushing and tearing. The behavioral evidence added another layer. The Mangle was noted for being aggressive toward adults, a characteristic shared by several animatronics, whose facial recognition systems had been compromised. Phone Guy mentioned that when the animatronics encountered adults during the day, they would just stare, treating them as potential threats, rather than guests to entertain. This malfunctioning recognition software could explain why an animatronic might attack an adult during a daytime event, confusing a security guard transferred to day shift duties with an intruder or threat. The fact that all toy animatronics were scrapped after the incident, as mentioned by Phone Guy in FNAF 1, seemed particularly significant. If one of the withered animatronics had caused the bite, why scrap the new, expensive toy models? The decision made sense only if a toy animatronic was responsible, and the company decided the entire line was too dangerous to keep operational. The Mangle, already in a destroyed state and representing the most visible failure of the toy line, would be the most likely culprit for triggering such a drastic response. Some theorists pointed to the restaurant's layout and the Mangle's mobility as additional evidence. The ability to move along ceilings meant the Mangle could position itself above party areas, above crowds of children, above staff members trying to manage the event. A bite from above could happen suddenly, without the warning that a floor-based attack might provide, explaining why security or staff members couldn't prevent the incident. However, the theory faced several challenges that prevented it from being universally accepted. The most significant was the victim's identity. Jeremy Fitzgerald was the player character during the week leading up to the bite, and while he was transferred to day shift for the event where the bite presumably occurred, he also received a paycheck, suggesting he survived the week and the bite itself. But if Jeremy was the victim, how did he cash a paycheck after losing his frontal lobe? Some theorists argued the check was issued automatically, or that Jeremy survived long enough to receive it before the full consequences of the injury manifested. Others proposed that Jeremy wasn't the victim at all. Perhaps another employee worked that day shift party. Perhaps a child was attacked, which would explain the regulatory changes that followed. An adult employee being injured was one thing, but a child victim would cause public outcry and force dramatic policy changes. The fact that Phone Guy mentioned animatronics were no longer allowed to walk around during the day suggested the bite happened when one was mobile during operating hours, but this didn't definitively identify either the victim or the attacker. Toy Chica emerged as an alternative suspect based on a voice line in Ultimate Custom Night, where she mentioned leaving her beak in someone's forehead. This seemed like a too specific reference to be coincidental, suggesting either that Toy Chica was responsible or that Scott was deliberately misdirecting by having a different animatronic reference the injury. The beak detail didn't perfectly align with the Mangle, who lacked a distinct beak structure, though defenders of the Mangle theory argued that Toy Chica's line could be dark humor rather than a confession. The larger question of whether the bite of 87 was definitively the incident shown in FNAF 4 complicated matters further. For years, the community assumed the bite shown in that game's minigames was the 87 incident. The crying child being forced into Fredbear's mouth while celebrating his birthday seemed to match the pattern. A child, a party, an animatronic jaw, a traumatic injury. But evidence eventually emerged suggesting that FNAF 4 actually depicted a different incident, the bite of 83, establishing that there were at least 2 separate bite incidents in the franchise's history. This revelation didn't necessarily exonerate the Mangle from the 87 incident, but it did complicate the narrative. If Fredbear caused the 83 bite, and a different animatronic caused the 87 bite, what were the connections between these incidents? Were they similarly structured accidents, both involving children at parties? Or did the 87 bite involve different circumstances entirely? Perhaps an adult victim and an animatronic that had been possessed or was malfunctioning in ways that pure mechanical failure couldn't explain. The possession angle introduced another dimension to the theory. Some interpretations suggest the toy animatronics may have been possessed by spirits of children killed in a secondary set of murders that Phone Guy alluded to when mentioning someone using a spare yellow suit. Based on patterns established elsewhere in the franchise, theorists proposed that if such spirits inhabited the toy animatronics, including the Mangle, this could explain behavior that seemed to go beyond simple malfunction. An attack during the bite might not have been purely accidental, but rather the confused, angry action of a trapped spirit, lashing out at adults who resembled its killer. Though this remains speculative interpretation, rather than confirmed fact, this interpretation could explain why the Mangle, despite being literally torn apart by children daily, might have attacked during a party rather than remaining dormant during the day, though whether it was actually possessed remains unconfirmed. Following this line of reasoning, a possessed animatronic wouldn't necessarily follow normal programming or behavioral patterns. It might see a security guard's uniform and mistake the wearer for the purple-suited figure associated with the murders. It might be driven by confusion and residual trauma, attacking anyone who came close enough during a moment when its aggressive behavior wasn't being monitored. However, these remain theoretical explanations for observed behaviors rather than established facts. The visual evidence of the Mangle in FNAF 3's minigames added an interesting wrinkle. In the Happiest Day and related minigames that dealt with the spirits of murdered children finding peace, the Mangle appeared alongside other animatronics. To some theorists, this suggested it had been possessed, that a child spirit inhabited the broken machine. This interpretation would lend credence to the idea that its attack during the bite could have been possession-driven, rather than purely mechanical malfunction. Though the minigame appearances could also be interpreted simply as representations of the animatronics themselves, rather than confirmation of possession. Yet for all this evidence and theorizing, the bite of 87 remained officially unsolved. Scott Cawthon never confirmed which animatronic was responsible, never definitively identified the victim, never showed the actual incident in gameplay or cutscenes. The Mangle theory, despite its substantial supporting evidence, remained a theory. Probably the best supported theory, accepted by large portions of the community, but never elevated to confirmed fact. This ambiguity was possibly intentional. The horror of the bite came not from knowing exactly what happened, but from knowing something terrible occurred, and being left to imagine the details. Every animatronic became suspect. Every character who worked at or visited the 1987 location became a potential victim. The incident hung over the franchise like a shadow, shaping policy and character behavior without ever being fully illuminated. For the Mangle specifically, the Bite of 87 theory added tragic dimensions to its story. If true, it meant this animatronic had been destroyed by children, left in a broken state by negligent management, possibly possessed by a murdered child spirit, and then either through malfunction, possession, or some combination of both, had inflicted one of the franchise's most notorious injuries. It would have gone from being a symbol of corporate cheapness and public destruction to being remembered as the cause of an incident so severe it changed industry regulations. Whether the Mangle actually caused the Bite of 87, we may never know with absolute certainty. But the theory persists because it fits so many pieces together so neatly. The timing, the location, the attack angle, the mobility, the scrapping of the toy line, the possession implications, they all align in a way that makes the Mangle not just a suspect, but the prime suspect. And in a franchise built on ambiguity and interpretation, sometimes being the prime suspect is as close to truth as we're going to get. Phantom Mangle and FNAF 3. 30 years after the closure of the 1987 location, after fires and investigations and multiple restaurant failures, Fazbear Entertainment's dark history became commercialized horror at Fazbear's Fright, a horror attraction designed to capitalize on the urban legends surrounding the chain. Here, among the relics and decorations meant to evoke the pizzeria's cursed past, the Mangle reappeared in a new form, transformed by time and trauma into Phantom Mangle. The Phantom animatronics in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 were distinct from the physical threats that had defined previous games. They weren't corporeal beings that could physically attack the player. They were hallucinations, psychological manifestations that cause system malfunctions and disorientation rather than direct harm. This made them particularly insidious. You couldn't defend against them with doors or masks because they weren't really there to be defended against. They were mental intrusions that had physical consequences. Phantom Mangle's appearance reflected this hallucinatory nature. Where the original Mangle had been white and pink with exposed silver endoskeleton, Phantom Mangle appeared burnt, charred, as if it had been through a fire that had scorched its casing and turned vibrant colors into sickly greens and blacks. The white plastic had become a dark, greenish hue, the color of old decay or toxic mold. The pink accents transformed into aqua green tones that looked diseased rather than cheerful. The rosy cheeks remained but now appeared as blackish green marks on the charred face, like bruises on burnt flesh. The eyes were perhaps the most disturbing change. Where the original Mangle had amber irises with black pupils, Phantom Mangle's eye sockets contained only white pinpricks surrounded by single white rings, giving it a vacant, unseeing stare that was somehow more unsettling than the focused gaze of the original. One eye appeared to be missing entirely, or perhaps merely obscured, adding to the sense that this wasn't a complete being, but a fragmentary impression, a broken memory of the Mangle given temporary form. The burnt appearance was significant for lore reasons. Fazbear's fright itself would eventually burn down, and the phantom animatronic's scorched look seemed to foreshadow this fate. But more than that, it suggested these visions were tied to the fire that had consumed the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, possibly the same fire that was meant to destroy the possessed animatronics and free the spirits trapped within them. The phantoms might be echoes of that conflagration, memories of animatronics as they appeared in their final moments before being consumed by flames meant to end the curse. Phantom Mangle's behavior in FNAF 3 followed a specific pattern that differentiated it from other phantom animatronics while maintaining its core characteristics from FNAF 2. It appeared on camera 04, one of the security cameras monitoring the attraction's hallways and rooms. The player would flip through camera feeds, monitoring for Springtrap's location and checking various systems. When suddenly Phantom Mangle would manifest on the screen, its burnt, mangled form staring out from the display. The response required was immediate. Close the monitor or switch to a different camera view quickly. Hesitation meant consequences. If the player stared at Phantom Mangle for too long, roughly 50 frames or about 0.83 seconds, the Phantom would force the monitor down and invade the office space. When this happened, it would emit a garbled scream, the same kind of distorted audio that the original Mangle's static had suggested, and cause audio and ventilation system errors. These system failures were the real danger. The ventilation error was particularly problematic because FNAF 3's security office had limited air circulation, and if the ventilation failed, the office would fill with a hallucinogenic fog that made it difficult to see and increased the frequency of phantom hallucinations. It created a cascading failure state where seeing one phantom led to system failures that made you more likely to see more phantoms, which caused more failures in a cycle that could quickly spiral out of control. The audio distraction also served a strategic purpose in the game's mechanics. Springtrap, the primary physical threat in FNAF 3, was attracted to sound. Creating loud noises in the office would draw him closer, making audio errors particularly dangerous because they brought the actual lethal danger directly toward the player's position. Phantom Mangle thus served as a force multiplier, its hallucination creating conditions that empowered the real threat. What made Phantom Mangle particularly interesting from a lore perspective was the question of what exactly it represented. If the phantoms were hallucinations experienced by the security guard, what was causing these specific visions? Were they psychogenic, created by the mind of someone who knew about the old pizzeria's history and expected to see these characters in a horror attraction based on them? Were they supernatural, actual spirits, or remnant energies from the original animatronics manifesting as visual and auditory hallucinations? Or were they something else entirely, perhaps connected to Springtrap himself, who had been William Afton, and might carry associations with all the animatronics he had encountered and murdered within? The fact that Phantom Mangle appeared specifically, rather than some generic phantom or hallucination, suggested these weren't random manifestations. They were tied to real animatronics that had existed, that had histories. Whether they were possessed by murdered children remains a matter of interpretation, but Phantom Mangle carried the appearance and behavior patterns of the original Mangle, implying continuity of identity across the 30-year gap between FNAF 2 and FNAF 3. One theory proposed that the phantoms were psychological echoes experienced by someone familiar with the original restaurants, possibly Mike Schmidt, or another character who had survived encounters with these animatronics and now carried traumatic memories that manifested as hallucinations when they found themselves back in a Fazbear-related environment. The burnt appearance would represent how that trauma had warped the memories, turning what were already frightening animatronics into something worse, something that combined the original threat with the knowledge of fire, death, and destruction that had followed. Another theory suggested the phantoms were more literally supernatural, spirits or echoes of spirits that had inhabited the original animatronics and now lingered as impressions in the world even after their physical forms had been destroyed. By this reading, Phantom Mangle was the ghost of the Mangle, or more specifically, the ghost of the child or children who had possessed it. The burnt appearance would represent their memory of the fire that was meant to free them, a traumatic event that had marked their final moments in the physical world. A third interpretation held that the phantoms were manifestations created by Springtrap or the entity within him. William Afton had encountered all these animatronics, had been killed by them in a sense when they cornered him, and he climbed into the Spring Bonnie suit that became his prison. His lingering consciousness in Springtrap might project hallucinations of his past encounters, forcing the security guard to experience his memories as terrifying visions. This would make the phantoms deeply personal, echoes of Afton's guilt and fear, rather than independent entities. The inclusion of Phantom Mangle specifically in this roster of hallucinations held significance regardless of which interpretation one favored. Of all the animatronics that could have appeared as phantoms, the game featured Freddy, Chica, Foxy, Balloon Boy, Puppet, and the Mangle. Each of these had specific connections to the lore, Freddy, Chica, and Foxy as the core band possessed by murdered children, Balloon Boy as a toy animatronic from the 87 location, Puppet as the first vessel inhabited by a spirit, and the Mangle as the destroyed toy Foxy that might have caused the bite of 87. Phantom Mangle's behavior, appearing on cameras and causing audio failures, echoed the original Mangle's radio static and ceiling-based approach. It was as if the core essence of what made the Mangle, the sound, the unexpected attack angle, the system interference, had been preserved across whatever transformation created the phantoms. Identity persisted despite the change in form, suggesting that whether these were memories, ghosts, or projections, they carried authentic elements of the original entities. The burnt appearance across all phantoms created a unified aesthetic that tied them to a specific event, the fire. Whether this was the fire at the end of FNAF 3 that destroyed Fazbear's Fright, a previous fire that had consumed an earlier location, or a symbolic representation of purification through flame, it marked these visions as connected to destruction and endings. The phantoms weren't just scary versions of familiar characters, they were post-mortem versions, visions of what these animatronics had become after their stories had supposedly ended. For Phantom Mangle specifically, this raised questions about what exactly had happened to the original. We knew the toy animatronics were scrapped after the 87 location closed, mentioned explicitly by Phone Guy in FNAF 1. But scrapped didn't necessarily mean destroyed. Parts could be reused, stored, sold. Did pieces of the original Mangle survive somewhere? Did the spirit or spirits that had inhabited it escape during scrapping? Or were they trapped in whatever fragments remained? The phantom's existence suggested that whatever the Mangle had been, some essence of it persisted into the era of FNAF 3, capable of manifesting or being manifested as a hallucination that retained identifying characteristics. The psychological impact of Phantom Mangle on players added another layer to its horror. In FNAF 2, the Mangle had been a direct physical threat that you could track and defend against. In FNAF 3, it became a threat you could only avoid, something that would harm you not through attack, but through the anxiety and system failures its appearance caused. This made it more insidious in some ways. You couldn't fight it, couldn't hide from it with a mask, couldn't predict when it might appear. It existed in that uncomfortable space between real and unreal, dangerous whether it was physically present or not. The fact that Phantom Mangle appeared more frequently than several other phantoms suggested either that it was more present, in whatever sense these hallucinations existed, or that it had stronger connections to the location and events of Fazbear's fright. Some theorists tracked appearance rates and determined that Phantom Mangle showed up in more minigames and had more opportunities to attack than several other phantoms, implying that it held particular significance or strength among the hallucinations. In the end, Phantom Mangle represented the Mangle's transformation from physical to psychological threat, from mechanical danger to mental intrusion. It showed that even destroyed, scrapped, and presumably gone, the Mangle's influence persisted. Whether as memory, ghost, or projection, it could still cause harm, still trigger system failures, still force players to react or face consequences. The white and pink had become green and black, the clean lines had become charred and broken, but the essential nature, dangerous, ceiling-based, system-disrupting, remained intact across the decades, proving that some things once broken leave marks that time cannot erase. Nightmare Mangle and FNAF 4. The nightmares featured in Five Nights at Freddy's 4 took familiar animatronics and twisted them into grotesque parodies, exaggerating every threatening feature until friendly entertainers became pure monsters. When the Halloween edition added Nightmare Mangle to this roster of terrors, it brought with it questions about what this version represented, whose fears it might reflect, and what its existence told us about the Mangle's place in the franchise's deeper lore. Nightmare Mangle appeared as part of the Halloween update to FNAF 4, essentially serving as a reskin of Nightmare Foxy, while adding its own distinctive elements. This connection to Foxy was significant. In the base game, Nightmare Foxy was one of the primary threats. A version of the pirate animatronic rendered in horrifying detail with massive teeth, long claws, and an aggressive hunting pattern. Nightmare Mangle took this template and applied the Mangle's characteristic features, creating something that combined the worst aspects of both characters. The design of Nightmare Mangle pushed the broken, mangled aesthetic to extremes. Where the original Mangle was damaged but still clearly mechanical, Nightmare Mangle appeared to be actively decaying, falling apart in real time. The white plastic casing was present but cracked and filthy, looking more like aged bone than clean plastic. Pink accents remained, specifically the rosy cheeks and lipstick, but they appeared more grotesque in this context, like makeup on a corpse. A desperate attempt to maintain friendly appearances on something fundamentally horrifying. The second endoskeleton head, already unsettling in the original Mangle's design, became truly skeletal in Nightmare Mangle's version. It looked less like mechanical components and more like an actual skull, complete with hollow eye sockets and teeth that seemed organic rather than manufactured. This blurring of the line between mechanical and organic, between animatronic and creature, made Nightmare Mangle particularly disturbing. It wasn't clearly either robot or animal, existing in some nightmare space, where both possibilities merged into something worse than either alone. The body maintained the Mangle's characteristic tangle of parts and wiring, but in exaggerated form. Wires hung like entrails, not neat bundles of cabling, but organic-looking strands that seemed to pulse and writhe. The multiple limbs were emphasized, giving Nightmare Mangle a spider-like quality that the original lacked. Sharp points and edges proliferated across the design, every joint and connection point becoming a potential weapon. Every piece of exposed endoskeleton rendered with knife-edge sharpness. Behaviorally, Nightmare Mangle followed Nightmare Foxy's pattern of activity, meaning it approached through the hallway and could be monitored through the doorway mechanic that defined FNAF 4's gameplay. The player would shine a flashlight into the hallway to check for approaching nightmares, and if Nightmare Mangle was there, they needed to close the door immediately to prevent it from entering. Once inside, it would attack, its jump scare featuring those twin heads lunging forward with jaws wide, the nightmare version of the Mangle's characteristic attack from above. The timing of Nightmare Mangle's introduction in the Halloween update created interesting implications. The Halloween update was specifically framed as additional content rather than core lore, meaning Nightmare Mangle's canonicity was somewhat ambiguous. It appeared in a playable capacity, meaning it functionally existed within the game's systems, but whether it represented an actual nightmare the crying child experienced, or was more of a what-if scenario, remained open to interpretation. However, the fact that Nightmare Mangle appeared at all suggested that the Mangle held some significance in the nightmare scenario. We knew from FNAF 4's minigames that a child was terrified of the animatronics, that his brother and his brother's friends tormented him with Foxy and Freddy and Bonnie and Chica masks, that a birthday party at Fredbear's family diner ended in tragedy. But FNAF 4's events appeared to take place in 1983, before the events of FNAF 2 when the Mangle would have existed, creating a timeline puzzle that has generated multiple interpretations. This timeline discrepancy created two possibilities. Either Nightmare Mangle wasn't part of the crying child's actual nightmares, but rather a later addition, perhaps representing someone else's nightmares about animatronics they had encountered. Or the FNAF 4 nightmares weren't strictly the crying child's dreams, but rather nightmare representations of all the threats across the franchise's history. The second interpretation would make FNAF 4 less a specific child's fear and more a compilation of everything terrifying about Fazbear Entertainment's history rendered in nightmare form. A third theory proposed that the FNAF 4 gameplay wasn't the crying child's nightmares at all, but rather Mike Schmidt, or Michael Afton's nightmares in some later period, after he had encountered the various animatronics across multiple locations. This would explain why characters from different time periods appeared in the same nightmare scenario. They were all part of Mike's traumatic memories, with his mind combining threats from the 83 Fredbear incident, the 87 toy animatronics, and other encounters into a nightmare amalgamation. Nightmare Mangle would represent his memories of encountering the Mangle during his time as a security guard, transformed by guilt and fear into its nightmare counterpart. The visual design choices in Nightmare Mangle supported this interpretation of traumatic memory. The exaggerated damage, the skeletal second head, the spider-like limb arrangement. These weren't just scary for the sake of being scary. They represented how memory and fear distort reality, taking something already frightening and amplifying its worst aspects. Someone who had experienced the Mangle as a genuine threat, who had heard its static approach, who had been attacked from above by its twin heads, might very well remember it in this exaggerated form during nightmares. The inclusion specifically in the Halloween update added another dimension, the holiday's association with fear and monsters. By making Nightmare Mangle part of the Halloween content, Scott was explicitly connecting it to cultural frameworks around terror and the supernatural. This wasn't just a nightmare version, it was a Halloween version, suggesting that it represented the Mangle at its most archetypal, stripped of specific backstory and rendered as pure frightening imagery. The fact that Nightmare Mangle functioned as a Nightmare Foxy reskin, rather than having entirely unique mechanics, suggested that at some level, they represented similar fears. The fear of something damaged and aggressive, something that used to be friendly, but had been transformed into a threat. Foxy and the Mangle shared this quality in their original forms. Foxy was out of order, kept behind a curtain, damaged and decommissioned but still mobile. The Mangle was torn apart daily, left in pieces, supposedly a plaything but dangerous nonetheless. Both represented the horror of things that should be broken and harmless, but somehow still move, still hunt, still pose danger despite their obvious damage. Nightmare Mangle's presence in the nightmares also highlighted the Mangle's distinctive features: the dual heads, the ceiling approach, the damaged state, as core to its identity. Even in nightmare form, even exaggerated beyond recognition, these elements persisted. The Mangle wasn't just a broken Foxy, it was its own entity with its own nightmare logic. The persistence of identity across forms, original to Phantom to Nightmare, suggested that whatever the Mangle was, its essential characteristics were strong enough to survive multiple transformations. The psychological implications of Nightmare Mangle extended beyond in-universe explanations to affect how players engaged with the character. In FNAF 2, the Mangle was dangerous but manageable, a threat that could be defended against with proper camera monitoring and mask usage. In FNAF 3, Phantom Mangle was a hallucination that caused system failures but couldn't directly harm you. But Nightmare Mangle was a jump scare factory, designed to trigger the player's fear response with visceral imagery and sudden attacks. It was the Mangle at its most purely frightening, stripped of context and rendered as pure nightmare fuel. This made Nightmare Mangle function almost as a meta-commentary on the character's evolution in the community's perception. What had started as an intriguing damaged animatronic with mysterious radio sounds had become, through community theorizing and game iterations, a symbol of decay, destruction, and unknowable threat. Nightmare Mangle represented what the Mangle had become in the collective imagination. Not just a broken robot, but an icon of how innocence could be torn apart and left in pieces that somehow still functioned, still threatened, still haunted the edges of consciousness. The Halloween update's timing also meant Nightmare Mangle arrived after the community had extensively analyzed and theorized about the original. Players approaching Nightmare Mangle brought with them knowledge of the gender debates, the bite theories, the possession implications, all the accumulated meaning that had built up around the character. This made Nightmare Mangle not just a new threat, but a culmination, a form that incorporated all that prior understanding into its design and presentation. Whether Nightmare Mangle was canon to the crying child's actual nightmares, or represented someone else's fears, or simply existed as Halloween bonus content, its presence confirmed that the Mangle had earned its place among the franchise's iconic terrors. It wasn't enough to have been a toy animatronic that got damaged and scrapped. It wasn't enough to have spawned countless theories and debates. The Mangle had become significant enough that it deserved its own nightmare form, its own representation in the purest expression of fear that FNAF 4 offered. In the dark hallways of the FNAF 4 house, with flashlight battery draining and nightmare animatronics approaching from multiple angles, Nightmare Mangle emerged as another layer of threat, another form of the broken fox that refused to stay broken. It was the Mangle as pure horror, the distilled essence of everything that made the character frightening, exaggerated until subtlety vanished and only terror remained. And in that exaggeration, it revealed a truth about the Mangle itself, that beneath the mysteries and theories and debates, there was something genuinely horrifying about a thing that should be harmless but isn't, that should be broken but moves, that should be understood but remains, even in nightmare form, impossible to fully comprehend. Later appearances across games, as Five Nights at Freddy's expanded beyond its initial trilogy, the Mangle continued to appear in various forms across multiple games, each appearance adding layers to the character's identity, while reinforcing core elements that had defined it from the beginning. These later appearances weren't just cameos or references. They were opportunities to explore different facets of the Mangle's existence, from playful representations to tragic backstory details to modernized reimaginings. In FNAF World, the franchise's unconventional RPG spin-off, the Mangle appeared as a playable character, transformed from nightmare-inducing threat into a chibi, cartoonish fighter. This adventure version of the Mangle retained the character's distinctive features: the white and pink color scheme, the dual heads, the tangle of parts, but rendered them in a simplified, cute art style that drained away the horror while maintaining recognizability. The game's loading screens famously use both masculine and feminine pronouns for the Mangle in different instances, contributing to the ongoing gender debate by refusing to settle it even in what was explicitly a non-canon adventure. Phantom Mangle also appeared as a playable character in a FNAF World, representing the burnt green-tinted version from FNAF 3. This inclusion suggested that even the hallucination version had enough identity and significance to warrant separate character status, that Phantom Mangle wasn't just the Mangle but burnt, but rather its own distinct entity with unique characteristics worth preserving. The fact that both regular Mangle and Phantom Mangle could coexist in the party roster implied they were separate enough to be treated as different characters rather than alternate skins. Ultimate Custom Night brought the Mangle back as one of 50 selectable animatronics, allowing players to customize its AI level and behavior patterns alongside a massive roster spanning the entire franchise. In this context, the Mangle functioned as a vent-based threat, with mechanics similar to its FNAF 2 appearance, but simplified for the custom night format. Players needed to use vent snares to prevent the Mangle from entering the office, and failing to do so resulted in the familiar jump scare. The voice lines added for Ultimate Custom Night provided some of the only official dialogue the Mangle had ever received. With its characteristic static-filled, distorted quality, the Mangle spoke in ways that suggested trauma, damage, and a fractured identity. The lines referenced being torn apart, being rebuilt, being mangled by children's rough play. This direct acknowledgement of the character's backstory was significant. It confirmed that the destruction at Kids Cove wasn't just mechanical failure, but an experience that the animatronic itself was aware of and affected by. The voice work itself was notable for continuing the gender ambiguity. Some lines seemed to be delivered in masculine-leaning tones, others in feminine-leaning tones, and the distortion made it impossible to definitively categorize. This wasn't a bug or inconsistency, but a feature. Another layer in the deliberate construction of the Mangle as a character whose identity resisted simple categorization. Five Nights at Freddy's VR. Help Wanted marked the franchise's entry into virtual reality and brought the Mangle along for the experience. The game included multiple sections and minigames where the Mangle played significant roles, showcasing the character's versatility across different gameplay styles and formats. The VR format allowed players to experience the Mangle's presence in 3 dimensions, making the ceiling-crawling approach and hanging attack more viscerally frightening than flat-screen presentations had allowed. In the vent repair section, the Mangle appeared as a threat in the ventilation system, requiring players to physically look around the virtual space to spot and ward off the approaching danger. The VR presentation emphasized the Mangle's multi-directional threat. It could come from above, from the sides, from angles that required actual head movement to track. This made it more true to the original concept of an animatronic that utilized 3-dimensional space in ways that bipedal machines couldn't. Help Wanted also featured a minigame specifically focused on the Mangle, a Build-A-Mangle challenge where players had to correctly assemble parts from conveyor belts while avoiding getting the pieces wrong. Get 7 out of 10 correct, and you succeeded. Fail, and the actual Mangle would emerge to attack. This minigame was significant because it directly referenced the Mangle's origin as a take-apart and put-together attraction, gamifying the process that had destroyed the original toy Foxy and created the Mangle. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC added more Mangle content in Halloween-themed variations, including Nightmare Mangle's return in VR format. Experiencing Nightmare Mangle in 3-dimensional virtual reality, with its spider-like movements and twin heads able to approach from any angle, created a horror experience that the original FNAF 4 had only hinted at. The sense of scale and presence that VR provided made Nightmare Mangle's already exaggerated features even more overwhelming. Five Nights at Freddy's AR. Special delivery brought the Mangle into augmented reality, allowing it to appear in players' actual environments through phone cameras. This was perhaps the most literal realization of the concept, an animatronic that existed in your space, crawling along your walls and ceiling, approaching through your rooms. The AR format emphasized the Mangle's creepy, damaged aesthetic, with the white and pink standing out against real-world backgrounds in ways that highlighted how wrong it looked, how out of place a mangled fox robot would be in any normal environment. Special delivery also added character skins for the Mangle, alternate versions that explored different aesthetic directions. Magician Mangle and Serpent Mangle offered themed variations that maintained core identity, while adding new visual elements, suggesting that the Mangle's design was flexible enough to support multiple interpretations while remaining recognizable. These skins weren't just cosmetic differences. They represented how the Mangle could be reimagined while retaining the essential broken, multi-part ceiling-crawling character that defined it. The game's email and message systems provided additional context through fictional communications from Fazbear Entertainment employees discussing the difficulties of working with the Mangle's complex endoskeleton. These messages revealed that even in-universe, the Mangle was considered problematic to manage, with its complicated structure causing problems for the staff trying to deploy and maintain it. The original ceiling-crawling ability was mentioned as an intended feature that proved too difficult to implement properly. forcing staff to settle for basic floor mobility, even when the design clearly anticipated three-dimensional movement. Sister Location provided a different kind of Mangle appearance through the connection to Funtime Foxy. While not explicitly the same character, Funtime Foxy shared the white and pink color scheme, the fox theme, and enough design similarities to suggest they were related. If Funtime Foxy was what the Mangle might have looked like undamaged, or if they were both variations on similar design principles, it created interesting implications for the Mangle's original state and intended appearance. The Funtime Foxy connection also raised questions about the toy animatronics' origins and whether they shared design elements with the Funtime line. If the technologies were related, if Toy Foxy and Funtime Foxy came from similar design philosophies, it suggested that the Mangle's broken state might have exposed systems that were more sophisticated than typical toy animatronic construction, possibly explaining its unusual mobility and survival capacity despite catastrophic damage. Help Wanted's hard mode and Princess Quest content provided additional Mangle appearances in various contexts, from blacklight versions to secret minigame cameos. Each appearance reinforced the character's status as a franchise mainstay, rather than a one-game wonder. The Mangle had transcended its original role to become one of the recognizable faces of FNAF, appearing across media and game types because players responded to it, because it had narrative significance, and because its unique design made it visually distinctive even in screenshots or promotional materials. The consistent elements across all these appearances, the white and pink, the dual heads, the tangled parts, the ceiling approach when mechanics allowed, showed how the Mangle's core identity had been established and maintained. No matter how the gameplay changed, no matter what new features or interpretations each game added, the Mangle remained recognizable as the Mangle. This consistency suggested that despite all the mysteries surrounding the character, despite the ambiguities and debates, something essential had been captured in that initial design from FNAF 2 and preserved across every iteration. These later appearances also allowed the Mangle to reach new audiences who might not have played the original FNAF 2. Players who started with VR or AR experiences, who encountered the Mangle first in Help Wanted or Special Delivery, would have different relationships with the character than those who remembered nights spent monitoring the right vent camera and listening for radio static. But the core elements translated: damaged robot, ceiling attack, dual heads, static sounds, creating a multi-generational understanding of what the Mangle was, even as the specific context shifted. The voice lines, the minigames, the skins, the VR implementations, each added depth while respecting what had come before. The Mangle in Ultimate Custom Night knew it had been torn apart by children. The Mangle in Help Wanted could be assembled from parts. The Mangle in Special Delivery maintained complex endoskeleton structures that staff struggled to manage. These weren't contradictory presentations, but complementary ones, each highlighting different aspects of the character's existence and the history. As the franchise continued to expand, the Mangle's presence in multiple games suggested it would remain a recurring element, rather than being retired as an artifact of early installments. Whether as playable character, threat, minigame focus, or background element, the Mangle had earned its place in the pantheon of FNAF animatronics. Not through being the most directly connected to the main plot, not through being the primary antagonist of any game, but through being consistently interesting, consistently debated, consistently compelling enough that developers kept finding new ways to include it, new angles to explore, new contexts where a tangled mess of white and pink could emerge from shadows or ceilings to remind players that some things, once broken, carry their brokenness forward forever. Thematic significance and symbolism, beyond the mechanical details of gameplay and the specific plot points of lore. The Mangle functioned as a powerful symbol within the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, representing themes that resonated through the entire narrative and touched on deeper ideas about innocence, destruction, neglect, and the consequences of carelessness. At the most fundamental level, the Mangle symbolized the destruction of innocence. Toy Foxy had been designed as a child-friendly version of a character that had proven too frightening in its original form. It was meant to be safe, approachable, perfect for the youngest and most vulnerable visitors to Fazbear Entertainment's establishments. The deliberate softening of the design, the pink and white colors, the removal of threatening elements like the hook and eye patch, the addition of explicitly friendly features like the bow tie and lipstick, all served to create something that children would love rather than fear. But the very qualities that made it appealing to children also made it vulnerable to them. The friendly appearance invited touching, grabbing, pulling. The designation for Kids Cove put it in direct contact with the age group least capable of gentle interaction. And the corporate decision to allow the destruction rather than prevent it showed how easily good intentions could be corrupted by convenience and cost-cutting. Toy Foxy's transformation into the Mangle was a corruption narrative in miniature. Something created with positive intent destroyed through a combination of innocent destructiveness and negligent management. This spoke to broader themes in the FNAF franchise about how Fazbear Entertainment's pursuit of profit consistently overrode concern for safety, dignity, or appropriateness. They created springlock suits that could kill performers but were cheaper than separate costumes and robots. They reused possessed animatronics rather than properly disposing of them. They built restaurants over the graves of previous failures, and they allowed children to tear apart an expensive animatronic daily, rather than protecting it or removing it from the destructive environment, eventually branding the destruction as an intentional feature to save face. The Mangle also represented the horror of things that should be dead or broken, but continue to function. This was a core element of mechanical horror. The uncanny valley effect of machines that move when they shouldn't, that have too much autonomy, that blur the line between tool and creature. The Mangle took this to extremes. It was literally in pieces, torn apart to the point where it should have been completely non-functional. And yet it moved, it hunted, it climbed ceilings with limbs that weren't attached correctly, saw through eyes that dangled from damaged sockets, navigated complex environments despite having no coherent form. This created profound unease because it violated basic assumptions about how the world works. Broken things should be still. Damaged machines should not operate. The fact that the Mangle could function in its destroyed state suggested either that the damage was less severe than it appeared, or that something beyond mechanics was animating it. Both possibilities were disturbing. Either the Mangle was tougher and more resilient than anything had a right to be, or it was possessed, driven by something that didn't need intact systems to move the metal shell. The possession angle added another layer of tragic symbolism to some interpretations. If, as many theories have proposed, the Mangle might be inhabited by the spirit or spirits of murdered children, then its physical state could be seen as a reflection of spiritual trauma. A child's spirit trapped in a broken, torn-apart machine, unable to rest, unable to escape, only able to express itself through the damaged mechanisms available. The fact that children had destroyed the Mangle during the day created a horrible irony in this reading. If a child spirit inhabited it, then it was being torn apart by the very people it might have identified with, suffering violence from those it should have been able to trust. This remains speculative interpretation rather than confirmed law, but it adds a resonance to the character's design. This mirrored the broader narrative of FNAF, where William Afton used his position of trust and authority to murder children who should have been safe in the family entertainment environment. The Mangle's destruction by children it was meant to entertain paralleled the violation of trust that underlay the whole franchise. Nothing was safe, not even the youngest visitors, not even the animatronics designed specifically for them. Innocence destroyed innocence, often without understanding what it was doing, while adults who should have protected and prevented stood by or enabled the destruction. The Mangle's multiple heads and tangled limbs also carried symbolic weight. The dual heads could represent fractured identity, a self-split between what it was meant to be and what it had become. Toy Foxy and the Mangle weren't really the same entity. One was a concept, a design, an intention, while the other was the reality, the consequence, the aftermath. The two heads might symbolize this duality, the innocent performer and the broken hunter existing in the same space, unable to reconcile. Alternatively, some theorists have suggested that if the Mangle was possessed by multiple spirits, the extra head could represent that multiplicity. Following this interpretation, unlike other animatronics potentially inhabited by single souls, the Mangle might contain fragments of several victims, their identities merged and confused in death, as their remains were merged in the machine they inhabited. This could explain the mixed pronouns, the confused behavior, the sense that the Mangle was never quite unified in purpose or identity, though this remains one interpretation among many, rather than confirmed fact. The ceiling-crawling behavior symbolized inversion and wrongness. Animatronics were meant to walk on stages, to stand upright, to operate within the vertical plane humans comfortably inhabit. By moving along ceilings, by approaching from above, the Mangle violated expected spatial relationships. It came from where threat shouldn't come from, using angles that felt unnatural and threatening. This spatial wrongness reinforced the character's role as something that had broken beyond mere mechanical failure into existential wrongness. The static and radio interference carried its own symbolic meaning, representing communication breakdown and failed connection. The Mangle seemed to be trying to communicate through radio signals, through coded messages, through the voices that listeners claimed to hear in the noise. But the communication never completed. The signal never connected. The message, whatever it might be, was garbled beyond understanding. This failure to communicate, to be heard, to make meaning out of the noise, resonated with the broader theme of spirits trapped in machines, unable to express themselves clearly, reduced to static and screams. The pink and white color scheme, maintained across all the Mangle's appearances, symbolized the persistence of the original innocent intent despite total corruption of form. No matter how damaged, how possessed, how nightmarish the Mangle became, it remained pink and white. The colors meant to signal friendliness and safety stayed the same, even as everything they signified was destroyed. This created a disturbing contrast. The cheerful colors on the horrifying form, the party aesthetics on the hunting predator. It was wrong in the same way that a children's song playing over scenes of horror is wrong. the dissonance between presentation and reality creating unease. The name itself, the Mangle, carried significance as both verb and noun. As a verb, to mangle means to severely damage or mutilate, to destroy through violent action. This described what had been done to the animatronic. But as a noun, a mangle is an old term for a device that presses and smooths laundry, crushing fabric between rollers. Both definitions involved violence, crushing, transformation through force. The name wasn't just descriptive, it was prescriptive, reducing the character to what had been done to it, defining it entirely by its damage. This raised questions about identity and how we define beings, whether mechanical or otherwise. Was the Mangle still Toy Foxy despite the transformation? Or had it become something new, something that deserved a new name because its nature had fundamentally changed? The fact that employees renamed it, that Mangle became its official designation, suggested that damage had transformed identity completely. It was no longer the friendly fox. It was the mangled thing, defined by its brokenness. From a meta perspective, the Mangle symbolized the FNAF community itself in some ways. Fragmented, composed of many different pieces and interpretations, never quite unified, constantly debated and discussed, but never definitively understood. The gender debates, the bite theories, the possession speculations. These represented the community's attempt to assemble meaning from pieces, to put together a coherent picture from fragments that didn't quite fit. Like the Mangle itself, the community's understanding was tangled, complicated, composed of parts that didn't necessarily connect logically, but somehow functioned together. The Mangle also represented the horror of neglect and how passive acceptance of bad situations can be as damaging as active harm. Fazbear Entertainment didn't deliberately destroy Toy Foxy. They just allowed it to be destroyed and then made excuses for their failure to protect it. This passive enabling, this refusal to take responsibility or make difficult decisions, characterized much of the company's behavior across the franchise. They didn't actively murder children, but they created the environments where murders could happen and then covered up rather than address the problems. In this reading, the Mangle was a victim of institutional neglect, allowed to be destroyed through inaction and then exploited in its destroyed state, rather than being helped, fixed, or retired with dignity. This mirrored how the murdered children were victims, not just of William Afton, but of systems that failed to protect them, companies that prioritized profit over safety, adults who didn't intervene when they should have. The fact that the Mangle could still be dangerous despite being a victim complicated simple moral readings. It wasn't just a tragic figure suffering unjustly. It was also a threat, something that could kill, that pursued night guards with the same aggression as intentionally malicious animatronics. This duality of victim and threat created moral ambiguity that defined much of FNAF's horror. These weren't simple monsters or pure victims. They were damaged beings whose suffering had transformed them into dangers, whose victimhood didn't negate their capacity to harm. Ultimately, the Mangle functioned as a concentrated expression of what made Five Nights at Freddy's psychologically effective as horror. It took something meant to be innocent and safe, a children's entertainer, and showed how easily that could be corrupted into something threatening. It demonstrated how carelessness and neglect could create monsters. It illustrated the horror of things that shouldn't function but do, that shouldn't be dangerous but are. And it embodied the terrible persistence of damage, how being broken doesn't mean being harmless, how trauma endures and transforms, rather than simply ending. The Mangle was innocence destroyed, damage personified, communication failed, identity fractured, and childhood corrupted. It was a warning about what happens when we let things be broken, because fixing them is inconvenient. It was a reminder that the victims of violence can become sources of violence themselves. It was a symbol of how systems that claim to protect can actually enable destruction through their passivity and unwillingness to confront hard truths. And perhaps most powerfully, it was a representation of how some things, once broken, can never be fully restored. You can gather the pieces, you can try to put them back together, you can even make them function in limited ways. But the original unity is gone. The Mangle would never again be Toy Foxy, never again be the friendly entertainer it was designed to be. It would always be the mangled thing, defined by its destruction, carrying its damage forward through every iteration and appearance, a permanent scar on the landscape of Fazbear Entertainment's bloodstained history. Conclusion and reflection. As we surface from the depths of the Mangle story, from its origins as a hopeful redesign to its fate as a ceiling-crawling nightmare, we can appreciate how this single character encapsulated so many of the themes that made Five Nights at Freddy's resonate with millions of players. The Mangle wasn't the central figure of any game's plot. It didn't drive the main narrative forward the way Springtrap or The Puppet did. It never had a game explicitly built around its story, the way Sister Location revolved around the Funtime animatronics. Yet it became one of the franchise's most discussed, debated, and memorable characters precisely because it crystallized the horror of the series into a single, tragic form. Every element of the Mangle told a story, the white and pink colors speaking to innocent intentions, the torn costume revealing the violence of careless destruction, the dual heads suggesting fractured identity, the ceiling approach inverting expected safety, the radio static hinting at failed communication, the mangled name reducing a character to its damage. We've explored how the Mangle began as Toy Foxy, a calculated redesign meant to fix the problems of the original Foxy by making him less intimidating and more approachable for the youngest children. We've seen how this friendly makeover became the character's downfall when it was placed in an environment where toddlers could reach it, touch it, pull it apart piece by piece. We've traced the transformation from pristine performer to mangled attraction, from mechanical entertainment to repurposed plaything, and finally to nighttime predator crawling through vents and across ceilings. The physical appearance we examined revealed a creature that defied easy categorization. Simultaneously mechanical and organic, whole and fragmented, single entity and collection of parts. The white plastic and pink accents fought against the shadows of exposed endoskeleton and tangled wiring, creating visual dissonance that made the Mangle difficult to look at and impossible to forget. The dual heads, whether design feature or bizarre addition, created the unsettling impression of multiplicity, of more than one consciousness occupying the same failing frame. The behavioral patterns we analyzed showed an animatronic that had adapted to its broken state in ways that suggested more than simple programming. The ceiling-crawling mobility, the radio interference, the strategic movement through party rooms to approach the office from unexpected angles. These were behaviors that transformed damage into tactical advantage, that made the Mangle more threatening precisely because it wasn't whole. We decoded what could be decoded of the mysterious radio static, finding stock audio where many expected hidden messages, but also discovering that the search for meaning in noise said as much about our need to understand as it did about what was actually there. The static became significant not for what it definitively meant, but for how it invited interpretation, how it suggested communication just garbled enough to remain mysterious. The gender debate we explored revealed less about the Mangle's true identity than about how communities engage with ambiguity, how we project meaning onto uncertain things, and how a simple question without a simple answer can generate years of passionate discussion. Scott Cawthon's yes response wasn't a cop-out. It was an acknowledgement that the ambiguity itself had become part of the character's identity, that the Mangle could be whatever readers needed it to be, because it had never been definitively limited. The Bite of 87 theory connected the Mangle to one of the franchise's most significant mysteries, building a case based on timing, attack angle, mobility, and consequences that made it the prime suspect, even if absolute confirmation remained elusive. Whether the Mangle actually caused that infamous injury or not, the theory demonstrated how effectively the character's design and behavior aligned with the law's dark implications. Through its various appearances, Phantom Mangle's burnt hallucination in FNAF 3, Nightmare Mangle's spider-like horror in FNAF 4, the playful adventure version in FNAF World, the voice-acted presence in Ultimate Custom Night, the virtual reality implementations and augmented reality appearances in Help Wanted and Special Delivery. We saw how the Mangle's core identity persisted across formats and interpretations. Each iteration emphasized different aspects while maintaining the essential elements that made the character recognizable and significant. The thematic analysis revealed the Mangle as a concentrated symbol of neglect, damaged innocence, and the horror of things that should be harmless but aren't. It represented how systems meant to protect can actually enable destruction, how victims can become threats, how trauma persists and transforms across time, and how some damage leaves permanent marks that can never be fully repaired. Throughout this exploration, we've seen how the Mangle evolved from a gameplay obstacle into a cultural touchstone within the FNAF community. It spawned theories, debates, fan art, cosplays, and endless discussions that extended far beyond its relatively limited screen time. This staying power came from how the character embodied the series' central questions. What happens to innocence when it's destroyed? Can damaged things be restored? What animates the broken? How do we define identity when form has been radically altered? The Mangle never provided complete answers to these questions, but that's precisely why it remained compelling. It was a character built on ambiguity and mystery, on the space between what was intended and what resulted, between mechanical and spiritual, between victim and threat. Every aspect of its existence invited interpretation while resisting definitive conclusion. In the broader context of Five Nights at Freddy's lore, the Mangle served as a reminder that not every mystery needed solving, that some questions were more interesting unanswered. It taught the community that ambiguity could be a feature rather than a bug, that characters could be complex enough to support multiple interpretations without any being definitively right or wrong. It showed that sometimes the search for answers was as valuable as the answers themselves. As new FNAF games continue to release, as the franchise expands into movies and books and new media, the Mangle will likely continue to appear in some form. Its distinctive design and rich, symbolic potential make it too valuable to abandon, too recognizable to leave behind. Future iterations might provide new context, new behaviors, new details that reshape our understanding. Or they might simply remind us of what we've always known, that beneath the entertainment, beneath the games and jump scares and lore, there's something genuinely unsettling about a thing meant to bring joy that brings only fear. The Mangle stands as testament to how effective horror can emerge from the mundane, how the everyday reality of damaged property and negligent maintenance can transform into nightmare fuel when combined with the right aesthetic and behavioral elements. It proves that sometimes the most memorable monsters aren't the ones with the most screen time or the most direct connection to the plot, but the ones that capture something essential about the setting's themes and the story's concerns. So as we conclude this comprehensive examination of the Mangle's lore, we're left not with all answers neatly tied up, but with a deeper appreciation for the questions. We understand the character not through definitive facts, but through accumulated interpretation, through seeing how different elements connect and conflict, through recognizing patterns across appearances while acknowledging that some mysteries persist by design. The white and pink will continue to appear in shadows. The dual heads will continue to stare from damaged sockets. The static will continue to suggest meaning just beyond comprehension. The ceiling will continue to be less safe than we'd like. And the Mangle, that broken thing that learned to crawl, will continue to haunt the halls of Fazbear Entertainment's cursed establishments. A permanent reminder that some damage endures, some questions remain unanswered, and some nights bring horrors that used to be harmless, back when they were whole, before they were mangled. Thank you for joining me through this deep dive into one of FNAF's most enigmatic characters. If you enjoyed this exploration, consider liking and subscribing for more comprehensive lore breakdowns designed to accompany you through quiet hours when sleep hovers just out of reach and the stories of animatronic terrors seem more real than they should. The Mangle's tale is just one thread in Fazbear Entertainment's vast tapestry of tragedy, but it's a thread that connects to so many others, illustrating how even the broken pieces contribute to the larger pattern. Until next time, may your ceilings remain empty and your radio signals clear.